In that lecture, you brought up Romans 9:6 when Paul says, "Not all who are descended from Israel are Israel," right? Pretty controversial, bold statement. And Paul, being a good Jew, goes to the scripture, goes to the Tanakh to flesh out that point, to argue it. Can you I got your slides from that lecture that I'm going to put up on the screen right now. Can you go through Paul's exegesis, how he sees in Israel's history a paring down process of who really is Israel? Can you see
Oh,
that
sure.
slide,
Okay.
Dr. Garroway?
Yeah, I made that slide at some point
Yeah.
a long time ago. So, I mean, Romans 9 through 11 is obviously incredibly controversial and has been
Mm-hmm.
read many different ways through the years, and to this day is read in very different ways. And I tend to be a minority in viewing it the way that I do. And to be frank, and maybe we'll talk about this, if I were not Jewish, the way I read the text might be considered offensive to other people.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
I think it's genuinely what Paul says, and it's the best
Right.
historical reading of the text, so that's the direction I go.
I
And the
agree.
question, of course, in Romans 9 through 11 is that Paul needs to deal with the fact that the overwhelming majority of his Jewish kinsmen are rejecting the claim of his gospel. And presumably, among the people to whom he's preaching, there are those who say, how can we trust this God that you are representing if this God had a people, the historic people of Israel, and God made promises to this people, Israel, and God had covenants with this people, Israel, and now you're telling us that by and large this people is missing the boat, and we Gentiles, who for centuries have been off debauching ourselves, now we're God's people? How is that possible? And so that's the question that he deals with in Romans 9 through 11. And I think, as I demonstrate on this slide, and Paul shows in Romans chapter 9 at the very beginning, is he says, look, what you think is Israel ain't God's Israel. And I'm going to spend 3 chapters showing you how that works using the very scriptures of Israel itself. And so he says, look, the notion that I'm advocating now, that some or even most of the descendants of Israel are not actually Israel. In other words, they're not Israel in the sense that they are recipients of God's promise and covenant. Paul says, I didn't make this up. This goes back to the very first generation of the patriarchs. So he says that, look, Abraham had 2 kids. One of them was Ishmael. One of them is Isaac. And on the Jewish reckoning, not the Muslim reckoning, on the Jewish reckoning, they're both descendants of Abraham, but only one of them is the recipient of God's promise, and that is Isaac. And then he goes on to say, look, Isaac had 2 kids. One was Jacob and one was Esau. And before they were even born, they wrestled in the womb, and God determined that the promise would go through Jacob and not through Esau. And then, as you know, Paul has to then deal with the rest of Jewish history, which frankly doesn't work as well for him as those first 3 generations, but he does point out that in the time of Elijah, or at primarily in the time of Elijah, there are moments when a huge percentage of the Israelite people falls away and only a remnant remains. And of course, the prophets, especially Isaiah, speaks a lot about a remnant of Israel. And you know that in Romans 9, he also gets into the question of the fairness of this, right? Is it fair that God just decided Esau was out? And of course, Paul gives the lame answer that Job gives and countless other people give, which is, hey, God does what God does. It's not a very compelling answer to me, but it is an answer that is frequently given by ancient Jewish writers. And what I think Paul is showing there is that his argument that in the present moment, there is a huge swath of what you think are the Israelite people, the Jewish people, that are in fact not it, is not some newfangled idea, but it's actually consistent with Jewish scripture itself.
So in your book,